migration at the United Nations University Centre for Policy Research, which is a big mouthful. But she's also chair in international migration at Coventry University's Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations here in the UK. She has been director of the South-South Migration Inequality Development Hub, so MIDEC, since 2019, and this has been a really high-profile project supported by the UK's Research and Innovation Global Challenges Research Fund. And the MIDEC Hub is a global consortium of 18 research institutions, 6 international organisations and numerous local and regional partners that aim to transform knowledge and understanding of the relationships between migration, inequality and development in the context of the Global South. Mary Setrana, who will be the discussant in this session, is Senior Lecturer in the Centre for Migration Studies at the University of Ghana. She's also Heaven's colleague in the MIDEC project and is a highly decorated scholar of migration studies herself. We're really looking forward to hearing her response to this paper today. So just a little bit of virtual etiquette. So please turn your cameras and your audio off during this session. Otherwise we just get lots of annoying noises. Background noises. You can put questions in the chat function at any time that you like, and after we've heard from Heaven, heard Mary's thoughts on this paper, and Heaven has responded to that, then we'll invite questions from the floor, and I'll gather some of those together and propose them to Heaven. The seminar will be recorded, the bits where people are speaking, kind of giving the paper and the discussant and the response, but then we'll stop the recording for the discussion, and that will not be recorded. We don't currently have a kind of mechanism to share the videos, but we're hopefully setting up a YouTube channel soon, because we have lots of talks from really interesting people, and we need to make more of that. So if you would like to tweet, although I know everyone's abandoning Twitter at the moment, it seems, if you would like to tweet about the event, then you can at Sheffield MRG, and we'd welcome your engagement on social media about it. Okay, I will pass over to Heaven now, and she'll speak for around 30 minutes-ish.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks for, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to come and give a paper, and secondly, thanks for the introduction, and hopefully that will set the scene a little bit for the paper, because I will be referring to some of the kind of ideas coming out of MIDEC in the presentation. So I'm new to this platform, so I'm really hoping the technology will work. We've lost the animation, but we'll scroll through and see how we go. Just to give you an overview of my presentation, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about refugee law and the legacy of colonialism, before talking about this concept of the construct, if you like, of refugee women in the imaginary. I want to talk a little bit about the way in which women are positioned as kind of victims of male violence in the context of the Global South, when looking at the protection of women in the Global North, and the way in which frames such as exotic other are used to kind of legitimate and justify a set of approaches which has really come to dominate the way in which the experiences of refugee women are looked at. And I'll talk a little bit about what this means for how we think about the protection of women under international refugee law. So the presentation is based on a paper that was just published in September, so it's kind of hot off the press, if you like, in academic terms. It was published as part of a special issue of the Refugee Studies Quarterly on Women in Refugee Law Policy and Practice, edited by Maria Dustman and Christelle Quirton, who are the co-founders and co-conveners of the new Women in Refugee Law Network. So it's part of a collection of papers really looking at and reflecting on a quite long history now of academic engagement with the issue of refugee protection for women and issues of gender in the context of how women's experience is constructed. I've actually been working on these issues for a very long time, in the sense that my PhD was specifically looking at the experiences of refugee women seeking protection in the UK. So I started work on this topic in the mid-1990s, in 1994, when I started my PhD. So we're talking nearly 30 years ago. I'm aware of that. And during the course of doing that work, as part of my PhD, I became involved with working with a group of women, primarily, and set up the Refugee Women's Legal Group in 1996. We produced a handbook on women as asylum seekers, gender guidelines for the UK government, subsequently adopted by the UK government. And I published a book which was based on my PhD called Refugees and Gender Law and Process in 2001. So that was a very long time ago. I'm very aware of that. But this topic has never kind of really left my mind, even though I've gone on to work on very many different issues relating to other kinds of migration, other issues around categories, and different groups within that. So, for example, the protection of children. So the paper really comes out of, and it's been a very long time in the making and thinking and making. It comes out of the fact that I have been deeply uncomfortable all through this process with the way in which the experiences of women have been represented and kind of constructed in a way that essentially flattens out their experiences. And so what I wanted to do in this paper was really to think about this through a slightly different lens. I've previously critiqued this approach through really looking at the depoliticization of refugee women's experiences, in particular the kind of way in which gender is constructed in relation to state projects of one kind or another, and the nature of women's political engagement. What I wanted to do in this paper was really to take a slightly different approach, which was to question really why these narratives have been formulated over time and what purpose they serve. And in many ways, this approach is much more strongly related to the work of MIDEC, which Lucy mentioned in the introduction, which really tries to decenter the production of knowledge away from the global north towards the global south, where most migration takes place. And in so doing, really questions the way in which narratives of migration have been constructed. So the paper basically draws upon post-colonial feminist scholarship, particularly people like Mohanty, Jorgen, and Spivak, who really engage with these issues of representation and what they mean for how we understand particular issues. And Spivak's work, I think in particular, is the basis of the title for the paper, Saving Brown Women from Brown Men, which was a topic that she wrote about, or an approach she wrote about in relation to the practice of sati in India, and the way in which, in that context, the colonizers presented themselves as being the sort of saviors of women by bringing this kind of civilizing force to a particular context in which culture was perceived to be very backward. So that was the kind of starting point, Spivak's work, for how to come to this piece of work itself. So let me start by just saying a little bit, and I'm conscious as well in the paper, if you've had a chance to read it, I'm very critical of white feminist scholarship in relation to the experiences of women from the global south. And what I want to suggest, and I do suggest in the paper, and I want to suggest in this presentation, is that white feminist scholars, and I include myself in this, have been largely complicit in a script which essentializes the experiences of women from the global south. When we talk about white feminism, though, we're not talking necessarily just about women who happen to be white. We're talking about a failure to engage with the highly racialized patriarchal structures within which refugee women's experiences are situated. So without more ado, let me just go on to really contextualize this paper by saying a little bit about, if the slide comes up. Well, I'll keep talking and then hopefully the slide will appear. I wanted to say a little bit at the beginning really about refugee law and the legacy of colonization. I think it's really noticeable that there's very little discussion of either colonialism or post-colonialism or decolonialism in studies of, sorry, we've jumped forward a slide now, so I'm just going to move us back a little. So in studies of refugee law and gender, there's very little consideration, if you like, of issues of colonization and how that might have impacted upon not just the experiences of those who seek protection, but also the way in which these issues are represented. And to a very significant extent, sorry, I'm having some slide issues, there we go. To a very significant extent, this is a reflection of a kind of broader problem, if you like, a lack of interest in the legacies and continuities of colonialism for migration studies and governance more generally. And Lucy, your work, of course, with Joe talks about this in particular. So really the paper starts by just situating international refugee law, and particularly the 1951 Convention, in the context of colonial interests, including the exclusion of literally millions of people who had been displaced in the Global South, in significant part as a consequence of the colonial process itself. So the examples of India and Palestine, partition in India in 1948. So around the same sort of time as the convention was being drafted, we had these huge displacements that are effectively associated with the colonial process. But what we also have is the construction of what Chimney has called a myth of difference, in which refugee flows from the Global South have been constructed and were constructed through the Refugee Convention as being somehow fundamentally different from those in the Global North. So essentially the kind of processes by which people came to be displaced in the Global South, and still do today, have been depoliticized. They've been extracted from the structural inequalities and racism that in significant part shape those experienced, and instead reduced to, for example, issues of race as in ethnicity in context, or issues of culture as a way of sort of depoliticizing those experiences. And we see the ongoing consequences of colonialism and those structural inequalities and racism in contemporary migration flows. So the starting point for this really is that white feminist approaches to the issue of international refugee law and gender have, if you like, this colonial blind spot. They have really failed to engage with, have ignored the ways in which international refugee law is deeply entangled with the history of colonialism. What I argue in the paper is that in doing that, in failing to engage with that history, they essentially have perpetuated a myth of difference in the way in which they've approached the particular experiences of women in relation to issues of persecution and protection. So as well as contextualizing the paper in terms of the kind of the colonial context, it's also important to understand what the implications of that are in terms of the way in which refugee women as a category has been constructed, not just in policy and practice, but ultimately in the imaginary. Because I think whilst white feminist scholarship in the Global North has really drawn attention to the challenges facing women seeking protection with international law, it's largely failed to reconfigure the ways in which gendered experiences are conceptualized and represented. So there are exceptions to this, and the paper does acknowledge those exceptions in terms of the people who have looked at the issue of refugee protection from a gender perspective. But I would say still, even notwithstanding those exceptions, white feminist scholars have been largely complicit in a script which essentializes the experiences of women originating from the Global South. So where gender is taken into account, and this was certainly the case with the Refugee Women's Legal Initiative, it's now the case with the Women in Refugee Law Network. What we're trying to do is to sort of draw attention to the fact that women are often marginalized in relation to refugee protection, that their needs are not acknowledged or taken into account. Unfortunately, though, I think what a lot of white feminist scholarship has done is that in taking gender into account, it's also then typically understood and represented women through this neo-imperial frame, which essentially and essentializingly disempowers those women by presenting them as kind of helpless victims or exotic others who need to be rescued from their backward cultures in the same way that Gaia Spivak was talking about in relation to Sati. And I think that's not unique to feminist white feminist scholars in this particular space. I think it's a kind of a reflection in part of the everyday representations that we see of refugee women, including those who are advocating for women to be protected. So, for example, in a lot of advocacy and campaigning work around refugee women and protection, we also see these representations because essentially those representations are a way of mobilizing resources, mobilizing interest in the issues, and bringing to the fore the fact that refugee women are often neglected in these discussions. So the kinds of images that we see in relation to refugee women are not just in advocacy at the kind of local level, but also in terms of global advocacy, for example, in relation to the UN system, have these very kind of particular and generalizing and homogenizing images of women, almost invariably with children, almost invariably in kind of larger numbers, so not terribly individualized, and often in this kind of quite victim-y representation, which basically shows them or suggests that they are kind of victims of this broader cultural context rather than of particular political processes. So what we see in a lot of representations of third world women, if you like, is this representation of them as victims. And I use the term third world women because that's the word, the phrase that Mahanti uses when talking about the way in which these images of third world women are essentially reproducing a range of colonial images and practices, which, while sidestepping the sort of deeply connected histories that shape those global inequalities. And I think these images are often reproduced in white feminist scholarship. Certainly when I was doing my research in the 1990s and 2000s, we had lots and lots of campaigning and advocacy work around, you know, particularly awful things that were happening to women in different contexts, often connected to those contexts, or what are perceived to be either the cultural or religious context within which that persecution takes place. And this has often led to a tendency to equate a gender with sex. So rather than really unpacking the gendered power relationships that underpin women's experiences, there's been a tendency to use gender as a synonym, if you like, for women. And we see this very much in case law. So the case of Sharon Islam, which was very significant in the UK in the 1990s when I was doing my research, but actually has gone on to be very significant for lots of other reasons in terms of the construct of a social group within the meaning of the Refugee Convention. That case specifically had this idea of women in Pakistan as being a particular social group that was in need of protection. And that phrase in itself, women in Pakistan, of course, entirely flattens out and essentializes what is a very varied range of experiences in the Pakistani context, reflecting not just issues of the country context, but issues of caste and gender and race and class intersecting to shape women's experiences. So whilst Sharon Islam recognized gender as a protected characteristic, it also tends to flatten out and depoliticize again women's experiences of violence and the context within which this violence takes place. And I think, you know, not reasons, in very well-intended reasons, in the context of the global north, women's experiences are often framed through this victim lens by lawyers and by advocates in an attempt to secure protection for women. And of course, part of that process means that women and the people who represent them then realize that this is the framing that is more likely to provide them with protection in the context of the global north. And so there's this kind of dialectical process by which these representations come to be perpetuated. So this is the case of Sharon Islam that I mentioned earlier. I was deeply critical of that case at the time because it, well, aside from the flattening element, it actually brought together two women who had very different experiences of violence in Pakistan and whose reasons for seeking protection were quite different. And in both cases, what the Lords did in this case, because it went to the House of Lords, was they did two things. One is they essentially personalized the violence by talking about the violence as being a personal affair directed against them as individuals. So they kind of ignored the structural inequalities associated with patriarchy and race in those contexts. But they also depoliticized it by saying, well, actually, all women in Pakistan are potentially, you know, in need of protection. So we won't even consider whether this is a political matter, even though in the case of Mrs. Islam, she was herself quite politically motivated, and that was part of the reason for her persecution. So, and I mentioned earlier that one of the things that happens is that advocates and lawyers then kind of draw on this approach to be able to try to seek protection for their clients, essentially. So the next slide, when it comes up, is the case of, I think this is a case that's reported by Oxford in one of her papers. You know, it takes away the potential for women to have agency because the requirement to be a victim means you have to present the case in a certain way. So in this case, which I believe was in the Canadian context, the woman was asked, what do you think would happen to you if you returned to the country from which you'd claimed to be subject to persecution? When she had originally answered this question with her lawyer, she had said, I will kill my husband. what actually came to be presented in the final case by the lawyer to the courts was, my husband will kill me. So this idea that women are not able to have agency because it's not consistent with the assumption or the expectation that they will be victims of male violence. So there's a kind of adaptation of claims and a fitting of claims into this dominant narrative around victimhood. The other thing that we see, and we see a lot of it in the literature, is this notion of the exotic other. So I mentioned earlier on, in terms of the kind of colonial context of the Refugee Convention, that there is this kind of differentiation between the North and the South in terms of the kinds of violence, oppression, persecution that were recognized or not recognized within the Refugee Convention as it was formulated. But one of the things that the refugee law does, refugee regime does more generally, not just law, is it essentially reproduces a very important divide between us and them. So states in the global North, on the one hand, are kind of civilized and law-abiding, whereas states in the global South are somehow backward, rights violating and gender oppressing. So the way in which this manifests itself, this kind of representation of us and them, is that women are much more likely to secure protection where they experience, if you like, exotic forms of harm. Most notably, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, and honor killings. These are the kinds of cases where the protection of women by the global North becomes the signifier, if you like, of a good society, in the way that Spivak was talking about the colonial powers in the context of India and Sati. So while these kinds of harm are kind of acknowledged and recognized as being things against which women should be protected, the kinds of domestic and familial violence which happens everywhere in the world, but including and especially arguably in the global North, is normalized and depoliticized, because you acknowledge that that violence was also a basis for refugee status. Then that would not only, as case lawyers would say, kind of open up the floodgates in terms of application, but it was also pose a threat to dominant patriarchal structures and narratives in the global North, which position the North as somehow being better and more civilized than the South. So again, the sort of focus on backward cultures renders invisible the kind of very particular colonial and post-colonial context in which violence against women occurs. And what it also does, and what I elaborate in the paper but don't have time to talk about in more detail here, is essentially positions Black and Muslim men as perpetrators of violence. So it feeds into what are already very deeply racialized narratives of protection in international refugee law, with what I think are very problematic consequences, not just for women who are seeking protection, but ultimately for the way in which the asylum system operates more generally in different contexts. It's already deeply racialized, and the kind of positioning of women as being subject to the violence of the men in the context in which they live, rather than the structural context of racism, inequality, and discrimination, really don't help us if we're trying to challenge some of the ways in which the asylum system currently operates. So the paper, I don't think the paper really solves the problem in a way. It was just a very important thing that I needed to do in terms of trying to articulate what I think is going on here. The critique of international refugee law on the basis of gender has historically kind of tried to really bring women's experience into the fore by highlighting the kind of very awful things that happen to women in the global South that might therefore need or warrant refugee protection in the global North. And as that has been increasingly difficult over time, not least because of the closing down or the shutting out of people from the asylum system more generally, what's happened in the gender space is that there's been sort of more and more effort to show how awful it is what happens to women in the global South, as if that somehow will enable women more easily to get protection. But what those approaches really fail to take account of is the fact that this positioning of women in this narrative, including by white feminist scholars, is part of a much bigger process of knowledge production, which essentially is needed to be able to support certain ideas about how the world operates and hide some of the profound structural inequalities which underpin the experiences of those in the global South who are seeking protection. So it's really an attempt to articulate some of those ideas. I'm not sure that it necessarily provides an immediate solution as to how we secure protection for women seeking asylum in a more kind of nuanced way. But what I do think it does is kind of, for me at least, highlights the need to change how we think about these things, or at least acknowledge that the ways in which we approach issues of gender and international refugee are very much embedded in these contexts of knowledge production, and these contexts which are rooted in these historical antecedents, if you like, around the convention. So in terms of what next, where next, I think bringing together these kind of different approaches to gender and international refugee law, really around kind of feminist legal studies, which really doesn't engage with colonialism, post-colonial feminism, which hasn't in very many cases engaged with the kind of legal issues around refugee protection, and intersectionality, of course, which tries to bring these different dimensions together, but often then doesn't sufficiently take account of either the legal positions or post-colonial feminism. So bringing those into contact with other, I think, is critical. I think we need to better understand the experiences of the women of the Global South, not by focusing exclusively or even primarily on their identities of women, which tends to happen in terms of the advocacy and campaigning work, but rather understand those experiences as being embedded in systems and structures and in inequalities and oppressions that are broader than the ones that are currently being focused on. I think we need to recognize the centrality of race in the workings of international refugee law, both in terms of its history, but also in terms of contemporary policy and practice. Tendai Chuma, the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism and Discrimination and Xenophobia, has just stepped down. She argues very strongly in her work that it's not just about the intersection of race and gender in refugee law, but about the way in which they're mutually bound together by its history of the way in which gender came to be highly racialized in the context of colonialism, but also race is deeply embedded in gendered assumptions that are context specific. And finally, I think we just need to challenge the ways in which white feminist scholars, and I have to include myself in this because I'm white, feminist, and arguably a scholar, we have to think about the way in which we ourselves have conceptualized experiences of women in the Global South. And that means really placing colonization, racism, and history at the center of white feminist thinking. And I think, historically, what I've tried to do in my work is really to highlight the relationships between women and the state, women in politics in the Global South, but actually the kind of knowledge that's constructed around the experiences of the women South. I think that's really what the work of the MIDEC Hub has taught me, and really shifted the way in which I kind of understand the dynamics of what's happening here. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heaven. That's fantastic. Okay, I'm going to pass over now, hopefully, to Mary. I know that she was having some microphone issues.
Hello, can you hear me, please?
Hi. Yes, we can. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to show my video, but I'm not sure if it is. It is?
Yeah, we can see you.
Okay, good. Right. So can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay, so thank you very much, Heaven. It's been a long time, and I've really enjoyed reading the paper. And I have a summary of what I enjoyed. I liked everything about the paper, although I have a few questions for you. Let me just read through the summary of what I think I derived from it. So from the paper, there are reflections on the history of the Refugee Convention, and it argues that this history is deeply entangled with colonialism and is reflected in the racialized politics of refugee protection, which also characterizes the asylum systems of the global north today. And the other part, which I also about the suggestion that the dominant framing not only shapes the terms on which women are able to secure protection, but also relies on and in turn reinforces deeply racialized representations of Black and Muslim men as perpetrators of gendered violence. And so coming back to the whole argument, which I do find a lot of sameness in terms of the argument with. I see. Let me first start with what I like most about it before I come to the others. So in terms of the argument, I think Kevin, you've been consistent. I've been working with you over the years, and I'm happy to see the consistency with which the inequalities emerge in your work in different dimensions, in migration studies and refugee studies more specifically, and the consistency with which now, especially with this paper, I see the bridge or the connections in terms of highlighting the inequalities, not only in policies but also in our laws and also in theory. I think that's where you ended up with the MIDEC work, the fact that we are looking at knowledge production. But in this paper, you show all three dimensions. So the knowledge part is there, the policy part is there, and also the law part, which you don't usually see these dimensions in particular work. And again, I also like the blend, especially going to your conclusions. I like the cases, but I didn't know that you were that much law inclined. Going to the latter part of it, where you talk about developing new theoretical approaches, I find it interesting. So you are saying that you think we need to bring into dialogue three main areas of academic thinking. So feminist legal studies, post-colonial feminism, and intersectionality. And so at that point, you raised it later, but I was thinking you would have also included the transnational feminism at that point instead of bringing it at a later part, although you highlight it. Maybe if you have a bit of explanation there. And also the fact that migrants should not be seen, the refugees should not be seen as passive but agents that can make there are some power dynamics. And again here too, I like it because in fact when you talk about intersectionality, yes, they don't consider the colonial power dynamics, they don't. But in this paper, using intersectionality and also trying to figure out the colonial obstacles that lead to some of these things is also very important. And you also, some of the suggestions going forward, I'm interested in the suggestion because we often find these inequalities and everybody's trying to find out which way. We have tried affirmative action, it didn't work. It didn't work it worked to some extent. We have tried different dimensions. But I also was interested in looking at the societal transformation, which you suggested, that is not just about looking at one dimension, but we need to build on the root causes. And here, these are the structures within which these things are embedded. And I like the comment about complicating the culture. Yes, we need to complicate it to be able to understand it. So looking at all these, I think I have a few comments which you may want to share your thoughts on. So using the post-colonial feminist approach, which is great, do you have any critique against that? So I am looking at the theory and how people have also looked at it. So in practice, what you have said are the realities. What do you say about these comments about post-colonial and using it in particular context? The fact that it breaks down the units into various, so now we have Muslim, we are talking about refugees as a category, I mean, you mentioned the representation yourself, and then we have Muslim, we have men, and I'm sure if we want to decolonize it further, we will have several categories. And from your conclusion, you were talking about the context, looking at the context. So the critique against the theory is that it breaks them into further smaller units that we may lose the value of it, or sometimes the people advocating for it also become ethnocentric, like the ideas of what the white feminists also talk about. So maybe if you can share your ideas on that. But I mean, I just want to hear your ideas because I see the way forward in that. Maybe I have an answer a bit to that. Is where you talk about the multiplicity of theories, taking a new approach. But then, what's your view on that? Because we have used what you call the white feminist, yes, but then you come back in years later for us to see the critique of it. And so I'm looking at the post-colonial and the other things you have suggested. What do you think would be the critique against that, and how do we also look at these corrections? So maybe I will just leave here for now and then hear your thoughts on some of these ones. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. It's great to see you. It's been a while.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to seeing you in January when I come to Ghana. So yeah, I mean, these categories, these different terms that are used to sort of define different approaches. I mean, there's critiques of post-colonial feminist approaches, there's critiques of, you can kind of go in a bit of a round circle around these things. I think the most important thing about the post-colonial feminist approaches compared to some of the others, and, in the reviews for the paper, people were quite uncomfortable with the term white feminism. They preferred liberal feminism, for example. And the reason for my use of the term white feminism is it's a kind of acknowledgement, and Setrara says it too, of the fact that feminists have in the global north have largely worked within rather than challenging the systems of capitalism and racism from which they benefit, essentially, right? So, they haven't sort of sided with their global south sisters. They've basically suggested that the way in which their global south sisters might come to enhance or improve their position would be to sort of aspire and move towards this kind of notion of what womanhood looks like in the global north. So it's a kind of reference point for everything else in some way. And what white liberal feminists or white feminists haven't done is really kind of reflect upon their own role in that process. You see the way in which feminism is used to justify all sorts of things in the global south. Look at the way in which US policy in Afghanistan has been kind of premised on this notion. Laura Bush talking about, saving women from the kind of things that are going on in Afghanistan. It's a kind of mobilization of feminism to perpetuate and promote the interests of the global north, not necessarily to perpetuate the interests of the global south. So I'm not, in a sense, I can't be critical of the post-colonial feminist approach, because the thing it does more than anything else is talk about that history and the structures within which feminism is located and the purposes that it serves, right? So for me, I suppose it's part of the work that we do in MyDeck. It's understanding what these phrases, these terms, these theories, what purpose do they serve? And they often are part of the apparatus that's intended to maintain white privilege, ultimately. I mean, that's, they kind of take different forms, but ultimately that's what they do. They either do that explicitly in some way, or they implicitly do that and kind of use white feminism as a cover. I was intrigued, though, by your reference to transnational feminism, because that's not something that I have heard about before. So maybe I'm going to throw the question back at you. And, what does transnational feminism have to offer that perhaps post-colonial feminism doesn't? Does it go further in some way? I mean, are there genuinely shared interests when there are these structural inequalities from which the global north benefits? I'm not sure. So can I throw the question back?
Oh, I thought, maybe because I was thinking aloud, I thought I saw something on the transnational approach to it. Did you say something like that in the paper?
No.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe that is looking at it looking at the context, and then because we are talking about refugees beyond the location where, so this time we are talking about refugees perhaps from the global north, in the south, in the north. And so we are talking about different communities that may be interacting now. So here the context is important, which is from the origin, and the laws being from the global north are interacting to determine the status of these people and their experiences. And so it gives you a whole round approach to discussing these issues.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So can I maybe go ahead?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So in the general terms, most of the time the policy, I think one of the issues you raised was there's no political space. If I got the reading right, there's the absence of political space for these discussions to take place. And I think globally, the UNHCR may be attributed that political space. And so just to highlight a bit about that discussion, and what do you think could be the way forward for creating a political space in that, just to throw more light on that.
It's really difficult, isn't it? Because the political space for protection is very limited anyway. And so, it's hard for me to be critical of, women, white feminists who are advocating, campaigning, lobbying for women to be protected. It's not that you would want to kind of critique that approach, because in the end, within the very limited opportunities there are for protection, it's critical that we take whatever we can. The problem is, I think, and it's what I'm trying to say in the paper, that ultimately doesn't necessarily improve the situation, right? Because relatively few women in general terms benefit from the particularities of what's happening. And the overall kind of impact or effect of that is to kind of limit the political space, because in fact you're not having any of the really meaningful, important conversations about inequality and about racism. It's very rare in a conversation, even very explicitly about the asylum system, that people talk about race. I don't understand how it can be kind of left out of this conversation. And the Refugee Convention was premised on these assumptions about race to begin with. So I think it's really important that we, I don't know who the we is, it could be academics, it could be advocates, it could be policymakers, whoever we is, we start talking about race, we start talking about how race and gender intersect, and we start being kind of much more strategic about the way in which we're not trying to just create opportunity for protection for a very small or particular group of people within a broader context. We're trying to shift the way in which we think about protection more generally, and that will have the effect of being more inclusive. So I think this kind of jostling for position over who's had the worst refugee persecution experiences, which tends to happen in relation to children as well, doesn't really address the kind of key issue about how the system is fundamentally, structurally biased against those people. So there's small gains to be made. I just wonder whether they're sufficient, or whether we should be a bit more radical about how we go about it.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just raise some two issues? So I know Heaven is very critical on these things, so and let me I was reading on the case, especially where the woman was misrepresented in her words. So she thinks that she will kill the husband, but when it was being communicated to, the story changed. And the many times these things happen, even in our courtrooms, and we don't even pay attention that these things are linked to fields that are just beyond the courtroom. It's maybe talking about that. Can you share a bit on your methodology? I read it, but I didn't know how you gathered all these cases and how you put all of them together. Maybe just on how you got around with the various cases and how you put all the various pieces to make this article the way it is, because it's a very interesting paper, and perhaps people can learn from how you managed to get to this point. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Mary. That's a difficult question, because the paper has been made more or less 30 years in the making. So my PhD research was with refugee women themselves and with advocates and lawyers, observing what was going on. And that's why I was very uncomfortable with the kind of flattening out of women's experiences, because, I worked with about 80 women from many different contexts, from Sudan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, who had very, very different experiences that could only be understood when you really engaged with the context within which those experiences took place. So that was the kind of, if you like, the kind of primary data for how I came to be involved in this work. But then, since then I've been involved in the kind of Home Office side of things, the kind of governmental side of things, issues of representation, and reviewing the literature and seeing how things are progressing. So in some ways, I feel like I should have done it differently 30 years ago, but it's that kind of passage of time, and you see how these things unfold, right? So, seeing how something that was intended to be quite radical with Refugee Women's Legal Group got kind of co-opted, brought into the UK Home Office, and then just became a sort of policy guidance note, which didn't really make any difference in the end, because it kind of got depoliticized on the way. So I guess it's hard to say what my methodology is, because it's a bit messy, because it's a long process. but it's critically important to talk to women, and it's vitally important to talk to women and do research on these issues in the South, not just in the North. Almost all the research on international refugee law and gender protection is done in the US, Canada, Australia, UK and Europe. There's very little research with women living in the global South, even though 85% of all refugees are in the South. So it's about this. I think the production of knowledge needs to be decentered again away from the North, because, as I was trying to say in the paper, the way in which these knowledges are constructed in the North serve certain purposes that are not about protecting women. They're about positioning the North relative to the South, being civilized and, you know, cultured and not barbaric, you know, and that then is the mechanism by which a whole lot of other things happen. So I think we have to move it south again, ultimately, because that's methodologically, that's the only way you can really understand what's going on. And given that's where most refugees are, that makes a lot of sense to me personally. But, you know, that's the MyDeck project, I guess. But yeah, it's been a long time coming, and I'm probably finished now, but I'm not sure.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. I'll turn over to the moderator. Although I have last comments, so I can come back later for that.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Yeah, they were really fantastic comments, and yeah, you asked about some of the things that I was thinking about too, so it was really brilliant to hear that discussion. It's nice to have a back and forth as well, rather than just a discussant give comments and then nice to have a conversation. Okay, so we'll invite questions from the audience now. Please do put comments in the chat box, which you can see there's a little kind of sound bubble, like speech bubble, in the kind of tab on the right hand side, and you can add any questions, or if you want to put your hand up, there's a little person with their arm in the air at the bottom, you could do that if you'd like to speak. Just while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I also had something which I think really relates to a question that Mary was proposing, and it's about how to break out of this kind of representational pragmatism. So when we're thinking about those legal cases, the lawyers are presumably being pragmatic in understanding this is problematic whatever way, but pragmatically I want my person to be successful in their case. Or if we think about NGOs, I mean, I don't actually know what people how people understand and think about those representations, because I haven't worked in an NGO in that space myself, but I'm just thinking how they're kind of using this extreme pragmatism, but it just reinforces that Orientalist lens and Orientalist perspective. And I'm wondering if you've got any thoughts for practitioners, or kind of general thoughts. Do you think a kind of intellectual academic debate starts to transform the terms of discussion? How do you intervene in that? I mean, it's a difficult question, but
it is a difficult question. It's an important one, though. I'm not sure that I agree with your statement, though, that people are doing this knowingly. I think a lot of people are doing this pretty unknowingly, as in we're so sort of embedded in these ways of seeing the world that people genuinely think that this is the best way to go about it. So you see this also in the case of children seeking protection as well. It's kind of very kind of infantilized approach to how children come to be in the global north seeking protection. And it's again a very sort of victim-y frame, even though those kids may have been, you know, very engaged in different ways, often kind of unfamiliar ways, in kind of political structures in different contexts. So if it was knowingly, I'd be a little bit less worried, because I'd think, well, okay, you know, people know the deal, but it's kind of very much for that. I think people have become, and I'm not talking here about the kind of, you know, people who are sitting around like me writing papers. I'm talking about people on the front line, in inverted commas. I think many people really genuinely believe that this is the best way to secure protection for people, that actually highlighting the really awful things that happen to people, because that's what happens in the global south, with these kind of barbaric backward cultures, often knowing very little about the context. I think they genuinely believe that's the right approach. And that's the problem, is that what we're talking about here is not just about the particularities of refugee women in the UK or elsewhere. We're talking about the dynamics of how North and South, if we want to use those terms, I know they're very problematic, but if we want to use those terms, of how they see each other and are seen. And that's a much bigger question than this paper or even this topic. Do you know what I mean? So, and I have to say, when I personally have tried to do this in those contexts, I have not been a very popular person. So, you know, people, if you go in and simply criticize the way in which people are doing things and not give them any alternatives, then it can be very difficult, because it just feels like you're being critical. The ways in which we have done it historically is really, you know, refugee women themselves mobilizing around these issues and articulating in their own terms, on their own terms, what the issues are and why they matter, and how they need to be understood in a different way, because they are kind of very context specific. So I think it's very hard for those in the North who are not necessarily familiar with context from which people come to be able to understand these issues, and it kind of is a reason why refugee women need opportunities to speak about their experiences, but also why there needs to be more research in the South, because at the moment we're talking about the construction of these issues in the North whilst being embedded in the North. Do you know what I mean? So it's very hard to be, you're just a critical bystander in some way in a dominant narrative. And in fact, you need to try and shift the narrative by shifting the production of knowledge to the South, so you get these more nuanced perspectives. But it's not an easy job, and 30 years in, I'm not sure that I have the answers, I'm afraid.
Yeah, thank you, Heaven. That's a really interesting answer. Okay, we've got a few comments come in. There's a comment from Chandama, which I think is an astute observation, which you would agree with,